Hey, what's going on, APUSH people? We have Key Concept 6.2 for you today. This one from period 6, which spans from 1865 to 1898. Before we begin, I want to give a huge shout out to Mrs. Brown's class from Arcadia High School. You guys are absolutely awesome. I hear you use my videos. I appreciate all your support. I hope you get extra credit for emailing me and getting a shout out. You deserve it. So thank you for your support. Best of luck this year, especially in May. All right, let's start off looking at 6.2. And it says the emergence of an industrial culture in the United States led to both greater opportunities for and restrictions on immigrants, minorities, and women. And that's from page 62 of the curricular framework. If you're not familiar with it, please click on the link in the description below and download it. It will help you out greatly this year. So some big ideas to focus on. 1, why were individuals attracted to cities? What opportunities were there in cities for them? 2, how did marginalized groups, women, minorities, etc., gain power during this time? And also, how did the federal government encourage westward expansion, and what were impacts of this expansion on natives? If you can answer these 3 questions, you'll have a really good grasp of Key Concept 6.2. All right, let's look at 6.2 Roman numeral 1. It states international and internal migrations increased both urban and rural populations, but gender, racial, ethnic, religious, and socioeconomic inequalities abounded, inspiring some reformers to attempt to address these inequalities. So we see a movement of people into cities and also rural areas as well as areas of the West. And we see people coming from Asia, especially Chinese immigration prior to the Exclusion Act in the early 1880s. And Chinese immigrants played an instrumental role on the development of the Transcontinental Railroad. And they would establish Chinatowns in different cities. And here's a present-day image of Chinatown from San Francisco, one of the most famous Chinatowns in all of America. And we'll see that different ethnic and immigrant groups will settle in specific areas of cities. And the Chinese would work in laundries and restaurants due to exclusion. There were not a lot of jobs available to them, so many of them would work in laundry industries as well as restaurant industries because those were the few jobs that they were able to take. Now we're going to talk about Southern and Eastern Europe, and this is something we've talked a lot about, and this is known as new immigration, and these were people that would come from Italy, Poland, etc. This is so important to know. I do have a video. If you have not checked it out already, please, what are you waiting for? Look at it in the description below. You have 10 million immigrants that came between 1860 and 1890. That is an enormous amount of people. Many immigrants settled in cities because they couldn't afford land. They didn't have a lot of money with them, so they were able to rent apartments in cities, and they took unskilled jobs, which led to some resentment from nativists. And we'll also see African American migrations. Many blacks sought to escape sharecropping of the South. They moved to cities both in the North and the South, and they would see this large increase in black migrations. And this is a trend that will continue, especially after World War I and World War II. That is known as the Great Migration. We'll get to that in future videos. Okay, let's talk about the makeup of cities. Cities are divided along class lines, and low-income individuals would live in tenements. And these would be really small apartments with upwards of a dozen people, sometimes more, living in them. And cities were often segregated by race and ethnicity. I already mentioned Chinatown. And many groups would live in specific areas of cities or ghettos. So there would be a Jewish area of a city, there would be an Italian area of a city, etc. Cultures of cities, you would see immigrants would struggle with autonomy versus assimilation. This idea of should they keep their own cultures from their countries or should they assimilate to American life? And you'll notice that second-generation immigrants were more likely to assimilate. Many economic opportunities such as factories and businesses proliferated, especially for unskilled laborers and immigrants who could work in factories. They provided work for them and money and other opportunities. And we'll see new textiles, new types of textiles developing, especially new forms of clothing. You'll see slaughterhouses in places like Chicago and Cincinnati develop, which will provide lots of business opportunities. So let's talk about Americanizing of immigrants and maintaining unique identities. Many immigrants were forced to assimilate. Now, my stepfather, he was born in France, and he came to America when he was about 7 or 8. And English was the only language that he was taught in at school. There were no French classes at school, and there was no English as a second language teacher either. So he was forced to adapt or assimilate to American society. And this is an experience that a lot of immigrants will share. There will be new career opportunities for women, immigrants, and African Americans despite social prejudices that they faced. Factory life provided income and opportunities for women and immigrants, especially women who would work in textile factories. Many blacks would take jobs as servants, cooks, etc., mostly in the domestic servant front, but they still were able to have new opportunities. So let's talk about access to power in cities, and it was unequally distributed. So we see different organizations develop to try to fix that. So we have the emergence of political machines, most notably Tammany Hall in New York City. And these political machines would provide jobs or patronage as well as food and money in some instances for political support. So they would give jobs to immigrants in exchange for immigrants voting for them. And Tammany Hall is associated with the Democratic Party. We also see the emergence of settlement houses like this one, the Hull House in Chicago, founded by Jane Addams. This would help immigrants adjust to American life, especially poor immigrants, and they would teach them English and provide room and board for them in their adjustment to American life. Women's clubs and self-help groups targeted social and political reform. You see the Women's Christian Temperance Union, the WCTU. This was the largest women's organization to that point in American history, and they sought to abolish saloons and alcohol. They will play a very important role in the Prohibition movement to come in the early 20th century. The National American Women's Suffrage Association was founded by Anna Howard Shaw and Carrie Chapman Catt, and they advocated the right to vote for women. And again, this is something else that will become very popular in the early 20th century. And they argued this right to vote would not challenge the separate spheres of that idea of the cult of domesticity that women are expected to stay home. And in reshaping that argument, stating that suffrage would not challenge separate spheres, more people would begin to support women's suffrage. All right, let's finish up with 6.2 Roman numeral 2. As transcontinental railroads were completed, bringing more settlers west, U.S. military actions, the destruction of the buffalo, the confinement of American Indians to reservations, and assimilationist policies reduced the number of American Indians and threatened native culture and identity. So there's this massive post-Civil War migration out west. It is encouraged by economic opportunities, such as mining opportunities, particularly in Nevada. You see Comstock Lode, which was this gigantic opportunity for mining for many Americans. Federal, state, and local governments would give subsidies to railroads to build and expand out west. Government policies also encouraged migration. You see the Homestead Act from 1862. This provided 160 acres of land, although it was not always the best land. A lot of times it was dry, but it still encouraged people to move out west, families to move out west and build homes. And here's an example of a homestead family that took advantage of this. The government also created the land grant colleges through the Morrill Land Act, and this created colleges particularly out west. Now, what were the impacts of this post-Civil War migration? Well, it caused violations of treaties with Native Americans, and it would also increase the amount of land available to settlers. So more American settlers are moving out west onto traditionally Native American land, and this would lead to conflict. And we see competition for land between whites, Indians, and Mexican Americans led to increased violent conflict. You have the Sand Creek Massacre, in which 133 people, mostly women and children, were killed. These were Native Americans. The Battle of Little Bighorn, also known as Custer's Last Stand, was when General Custer and his men were all killed in this very famous battle. So the American government and Native Americans would have lots of conflicts. Now, the U.S. generally responded to American Indian resistance with force. This is the last idea the AP curriculum wants you to know. So the Battle of Wounded Knee in 1890, this was where 300 natives, again, mostly women and children, died in this massacre. Now, tribes were dispersed onto smaller reservations during this time. You see the Dawes Act, which sought to assimilate or Americanize Native Americans. Native American tribes were dissolved, and it was focused more of individual families as opposed to an entire tribe. And they would sell this land. There would be lots of Native American land, and they would sell it to white settlers moving out west. Now, heads of these Native American families would receive 160 acres of land, and this would shift the way of a Native American life from hunting to farming. So it really drastically changed the way Native Americans lived. Now, the government also pursued a policy of assimilation that sought to end tribal identities. Again, through the Dawes Act, we see many Native American children were sent to boarding schools. They were forced to learn English, and many of them were converted to Christianity, and Native Americans' lives were changed. Again, this idea of going from hunting and gathering to simply farming, and this drastically altered Native American life. Most of the natives' land was lost through the Dawes Act. We're talking about an enormous amount of land was lost. And finally, the U.S. sought to end the ghost dance, which was perceived as a form of resistance. This was a religious movement or ceremony by Native Americans in which they envisioned that whites would leave their land and the buffalo would return. And this actually helped contribute to the Battle of Wounded Knee in 1890. The U.S. government did not like the ghost dance. They hoped that the Native Americans would not practice that. Okay, let's go over some test tips for multiple choice and short answer questions. Be familiar with ways immigrants adapted to life in America, whether it's through political machines, settlement houses, etc. And also be familiar with reasons for westward expansion, not just economic opportunities, but also ways that the federal government encouraged westward expansion. For essay questions, immigration patterns, they could be comparing new immigration to old immigration prior to the Civil War, or even immigration after 1965, which we'll get to later this year. And also, what was the impact of westward expansion on Native Americans? Native Americans could be a very popular essay topic for this period. All right, guys, thank you very much for watching. If you haven't already, please take a moment to subscribe to my channel and help me spread the word. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them in this comment section below. And I leave you with a political cartoon here that deals with this time period that we just talked about. So see if you know who that guy is and what is the meaning of the cartoon. If you want to write about it in the comment section below, that would be great. I thank you guys for watching. Best of luck to you this year and have a good day.